Okay, the position on the screen is a king and pawn ending, and king and pawn endings are actually more difficult than they look. There's the idea of opposition and there's the idea of time that gets used in king and pawn endings. So this looks like a simple position. Who wins? You can pause the lesson and have a think or have a discussion with your group. Who wins this position? The answer is it depends whose turn it is to move. If it's white's turn to move, white wins the game. And the way white wins is he moves his pawn to the 7th rank without check. It's very important that he promotes the pawn or gets the pawn to the 7th rank without check. Of course, if the king is in contact with the pawn, then kings can't meet. So this is an illegal move. Listen for the siren. There you go. So he can't capture the pawn. He has to move somewhere, and the only square he's allowed to move to is here. And in my live classes, some people get the next move wrong. What's the next move? Naturally enough, if you move the pawn, you do get a queen, and it is check, but you lose your queen immediately, and it becomes a draw. So after king c7, the best move is to move the king up, so that you now have control of this square. Whatever black does next, now we get ourselves a queen, and we do the paddock checkmate. If you don't know how to checkmate with a king and a queen versus a king, there's a whole lesson in the video lessons about how to do that, and it's actually a very easy win for white from there. So the answer is that if it's white's turn to move, he wins. However, if it's black's turn to move, he draws by something called the opposition. He draws by playing his king across here and getting what's called the opposition. When the two kings face each other with one square between them like this, this is called the opposition. And because he now has the opposition, he wins, or he manages to get a draw. White has no good moves. If he moves his king away from his pawn, if he was to move his king over here for instance, this king comes up and attacks the pawn. So that's no use. So the only real try is to move the pawn and give check. When the pawn gets onto the 7th rank there with check, it ends up a draw. This king now just gets in behind there. And once again, if the king moves away from the pawn, if he was to move over here or something odd like that, then obviously the black king would take the pawn, just capture the pawn. So that's no good. So he has to move his king here and keep contact with the pawn. And now you'll see that it's black's turn to move, but black has no legal move. It's just what's called a stalemate. You can't move to either of these squares because kings can't meet. Can't take the pawn for the same reason, and he can't move into check. So it's a draw. So here's another position. It's white's turn to move, and he's got 2 pawns, and so he should be able to win this position. Have a think about how you'd win this position if you were white. Press pause if you need more time. What we can do here is reproduce the first position. We move our pawn up and give check. The king has to take that queen, and now we gain the opposition. We are now, the kings are facing each other with one square between them, but it's not our turn, so we gain the opposition. There's only one legal move for black, and that's to go there. And now our pawn moves on to the 7th rank without check. Only legal move for black is to move his king away from the queening square. This king comes up so that he gains control of the queening square. And now we are winning a queen, and therefore we can use the paddock checkmate to win the game. Here's another king and pawn ending, and it illustrates an important point you need to know about king and pawn endings. How would you win this one? Have a think. If you need more time, press pause. If you advance your king, you only get a draw. If this king can get in behind your pawn on the rook file, because it's a rook pawn, you'll never get him out of there, it's a draw. And if you want to experiment with that position, then you'll see that you cannot remove that king. In the original position, the way to win is the concept of connected passed pawns. They're passed pawns because no other pawn stops them from getting to the end of the board. The winning move is this move. If the black king takes the pawn, this one runs away and becomes a queen. So he cannot take that pawn. Well, what else can he do? Well, he can go back to this square here, which is fine because this pawn's protected. What you do now is you bring your king up and you just march your king up. If he comes here, you just take the opposition. Now you've got the opposition, you'll win. And he comes back here. And now we force him out. That's the only legal move, is to come here. We don't have to worry about this pawn at all. We take control of the queening square and it's game over. Get ourselves a queen and that's the end of that. But just be aware that you don't want to have a lone rook pawn if the king can get in behind it, because that will be a draw. Rook pawns are a sort of a special case. Okay, here's another position. It's actually a little bit tricky to win immediately. How would you win this one? It's white's turn to move. Now, if he moves his king to the wrong place, he'll only get a draw out of this game. He's risking stalemate. If he moves his king across one square, that's going to be a draw, stalemate. So how would you win this one? Press pause if you think you need more time. And what you play is king d5. King takes the pawn. And now this is the important move. At the moment, black's got the opposition. He's just moved and he's got this situation where the kings opposite each other, one square in between. The move to play is f6, taking control of this square here and winning the game. Now the most likely try by black is to go to e8. And what would you do in this position? What you do is you take the opposition, king e6, and you've got the opposition, and we're back to our original position, and it's black's turn to move. It's only good tries to go to f8, and now the pawn makes it to the 7th rank without check, which means the king gets forced out, and we go on to win from there. So that's the best way to go about that. If you get to this position here, instead of e8 he tries d8, where should you play your king? This is very important. You need to play your king to... Oops, sorry, pardon me. You need to play your king so that you keep the opposition. And now he comes across and you keep opposition with him and the same position as before. If he plays to d8 and you immediately move across here, then suddenly now he's got the opposition, and as we discussed, that's a draw. So you've got to be a bit careful about keeping the opposition, and just take your time and think through these king and pawn endings, because they can be quite tricky. In fact, this is one of the video lessons I'd recommend you need to play through more than once if you're not quite sure, because once you understand these ideas and they click, they'll serve you very well for all of your chess games throughout your life. You win a lot of games that you would have otherwise drawn if you understand these ideas. Okay, here's another position where white should win easily. What would you play in this position? You can't let black just consume your pawn, but it does get tricky. Play b4, you protect the pawn because you block the entry point for the black king towards this pawn here. And so he goes back to d6 and king comes up to e2, king's coming around, king to d3, and now he's attacking the pawn and you're protecting it. But it's a little bit tricky. King goes back to b7, king comes up, and now see black has the opposition. And there's a check, king over to b7. And here's where it gets interesting. If you play b5, it ends up a draw. King goes back to b8. And what can you really play? Play your king up, gets the opposition again. E7 with check, king over to b8, and that looks like a draw. So what you've got to do this position here is, rather than move the pawn up like this, you need to take the opposition. And if you only had one pawn left, this would probably now be a draw. But because you've got the extra pawn, you can win. King c6. This should look similar to our first position on the board. King c8, he's got the opposition. And if you only had the one pawn, this would now be a draw. But because you've got this pawn here, you can waste a move, and now you get the opposition. King to b8, b7, moves on without check, king over to a7, king c7, and so on. So, king and pawn endings, this idea of the opposition is very important. Particularly study the first position that we looked at, and it's a whole area of study in chess endgames, and particularly king and pawn endgames. The key ideas being the opposition and moving the pawn onto the 7th rank without check. It's well worth knowing about. If you're winning a chess game by just one pawn at the end, it's a great feeling to go on and convert that to a win. Whereas if you spent 4 hours on a chess game and you should have won it and you end up with a draw, that can be very disappointing. So king and pawn endgames, very involved and will repay study. Lots of ideas, important ideas to know about, like protected passed pawn that we looked at, and the opposition. So good luck with your endgame play.